I'm going to start with the introduction and let people join us over the next few minutes. So welcome. Of course, this is our weekly series that's organized by the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative. Our aim is to bring together brain science and business in an effort to improve business, drive new discoveries and applications, and enhance the education of future leaders. And as many of you know who have attended previous sessions, this video conference discussion series aims to focus on a topic that has neuroscience and business implications of broad interest, but that's also really relevant to our current events. And of course, today's topic aims to explore the question of what is rational during a pandemic. I think a question that will hit on themes that we've discussed in previous sessions and previous weeks, but framed with, of course, new panelists and new perspectives, and I think it'll be really fun and interesting. So to briefly introduce the panelists and begin our formal program, I'll just mention a few factoids about each of them. So our first panelist is Colin Kammerer, who's the Robert Kirby Professor of Behavioral Finance and Economics at the California Institute of Technology. He's also the Leadership Chair and Director of the TNC Chen Center for Social and Decision Neuroscience, and a Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative. We should not forget that. So he's one of our first panelists. David Dillenberger is the Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Pennsylvania. And Sendri Hutcherson is the Assistant Professor of Psychology at the University of Toronto. And of course, Michael Platt and I will serve as co-moderators, as we do in each of the weekly sessions. Michael Platt is the Faculty Director of the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative, a Professor of Marketing, Neuroscience, and Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. And I'm Zab Johnson. I'm the Executive Director and Senior Fellow of the Wharton Neuroscience Initiative. And Kate Molt is serving as the session official moderator. So if there are technical glitches that happen during our session today, she's in charge of that. And she will also copy and paste the URL now into the chat window that has our recordings of all of our previous sessions that you can find should you have missed any of those or be interested in watching others. So before we start the session, I'll just remind everyone of the sort of ground rules for how we run these things. So we want this to be as interactive and dynamic and lively as possible. We understand that sometimes the video conferencing platform is not the ideal situation for that, but we try our best. And so what I would encourage you to do is to write questions that you might have in the chat window that you can find on the right side of the BlueJeans app under chat. And this allows you to both remember your question if we don't get to it until further into our program, but it also allows us to know what questions are the most relevant and what have been answered throughout the session, and be able to sort of bring that and make that timely and relevant as possible. So that's really helpful for us. And I will sort of moderate that chat window. It doesn't need to be formal. You don't have to write all of your specific thoughts and words. We can get the gist, so don't feel pressured. And so what we'll do is sort of start with each of our panelists giving a brief overview of their work and their thinking and their background and how it's relevant to today's conversation. And then sort of move into the more dynamic and discussion-oriented phase of today's program. So thank you, everybody. So we're going to start with Colin. So Colin, of course, studies how people behave when they make decisions from the perspective of economics, psychology, and neuroscience. And I think we could spend an entire hour, I think maybe even just talking about how to define what is rational, in and outside of the current pandemic. But I think Colin will have an interesting perspective from people's behavior.
Yeah, thanks very much, Zab. So I'm going to talk about habits, and Mike, I think Michael's going to fill in on some kind of neuroscience background of where all this all comes from, but habits are like right in the morning and you have kind of a routine where you drive to work or you walk your dog. And habits are the brain's way of saying, I'm in a situation, it's familiar. What did I do last time? I'm just going to do that again if the habit was reliably rewarding. So there's an idea called reward prediction error that is a kind of key driver for how people learn what to do and how people learn, acquire habits and so on. And we like to think of habits as we want to understand them at three levels, which is kind of the functional, like what are they for? Why did evolution install these habits? How do they maybe get installed over a human's life cycle from childhood beyond? What is the algorithmic specification? So we like to have some equations, like if you were to build a habitized robot, what is the sort of algorithm that would generate habits and would switch away from habits when they're dysfunctional. And then we also understand the neural mechanism. So in the pandemics, there's something very interesting, which is the good news about habits is it conserves executive function, scarce kind of concentration and brain resources. But it means that if a better option arises, we may be kind of blind to it, because the whole point of habit is if it worked in the past, just keep doing it. And so there's a beautiful study of the London Tube. And a few years ago, there was a strike on the London Tube subway system. But the strike was only part of the subway system. So it was kind of a cool natural experiment, because some people could not take the regular commute and other people could. So you can see what happened to the people who were forced to explore and find a new way to get to work. They couldn't take the regular subway line. And what happened is a few percent of them found a better commute, because they were in habit mode, they didn't bother to explore and find that, and they switched their commute and saved a bunch of time. So what we're interested in and starting to study empirically in the pandemic is a lot of things that are part of our habitual routine are just gone. It's like they're stocked out of the vending machine. We commuting to work in the same way. A lot of people, you can't go to the gym if you're used to going to the gym, or maybe parks are closed and beaches, they've just reopened in California. And what are the new habits that kind of replace the old habits? And some of them will be better, like in the London Tube. In other words, we'll find a food delivery service that we really like, or it turns out, we may have Zoom calls with family members, and you kind of connect with each other in a better way than you had done before, trying to play tag on text messaging. And I think the big examples, we don't know much yet about what the new normal habits will be, involve exercise, maybe cooking and food. Like food delivery, I think, is going to have a big uptick. School, online learning, particularly smaller children probably will continue to go back to school and be in a school place, because physically being near each other is kind of a big deal. As kids are older, it's probably less and less necessary. Telework, I think there will be a big boom in telework, especially for knowledge professionals who don't, have to sit next to somebody in order to do their work. And things like entertainment. Are people going to go back to movie theaters? I think they probably will not. And of course, there's some economics in the basics. Neuroeconomics is also about taking economics seriously. There's some supply side economics here that's important too, which is, development and a big boom in tools in things that make pandemic life more tolerable and fun, like Netflix for watching things at home, and lots of other streaming services, Zoom and other platforms that make, like, telework, having meetings with your colleagues where you don't have to sit in a conference room, you can sit in a gallery view. And so I think those are the things that are, so the rational part is that habits are evolutionarily valuable. They're not rational in the sense that when you're focused on a habit, you're, again, not thinking about all these other cool things that maybe came along when you were in habit mode. But there's a biological rationality to it. And so we're studying, what's likely to happen in the future. And the goal is if the social science and economics was a little bit more mature, we could really say things like, a year from now, I can tell you what people are going to continue to do and what people are going to go back to the old normal and do the same as they always have. We can't quite make sharp predictions like that, but we have a lot of ideas about what might happen.
Great. Thanks very much, Colin. So we'll move to David. I know that David's a lot of David's work from an economic perspective is sort of the impact of risk and time on decision making and economic decision theory, and I'm sure that he may have a different perspective on how risks and time might impact the kinds of habits that Colin is talking about as well.
Maybe or maybe not, but in any case, my name is David, or Dudi, and indeed my work is mostly focused on decision-making under risk and uncertainty. And one thing that I'm interested in is people's demand for information, or like whether or not people seek information and in what form. Now, if you open the standard economic textbooks, it argues that more information is always beneficial. It improves planning and leads to better decisions, so you can always ignore it, so why not? But it seems that especially in time of pandemic, it is not so irrational to display what I will call information avoidance. Let me give two brief examples that came to my mind. Hopefully we can elaborate more later when we discuss things. So the first thing is about checking the status of your portfolio allocation. So it's definitely important to check from time to time and adjust accordingly. But I think that too frequently now can be very harmful. First, checking daily your portfolio holding, I don't know from your experience, but for me, starting in March, it became really a masochistic activity to do, even if I don't do anything, just looking at it. Just seeing its value go up and down in magnitude that I never experienced before, it makes me anxious, at least until I get used to it. Now, independently of the experience from looking, the question is what a person is going to do with this information. And the risk is that people will overly react and will behave due to the fear, and this defeat the goal of investing in the first place. If it's a long-term investment, perhaps the best thing to do, given that we have no clue what's going on, it's a pandemic and it's a lot of uncertainty. So at least my strategy was don't do anything, just wait, leave it as is. Most likely that 10 years from now, we look back and we'll see, well, there were a couple of months of some outlier, but the overall trend is stayed the same. So again, one thing is how people will react to information with respect to their portfolio allocation. Another thing, which is maybe more concrete to the issue in hand, is the idea of medical testing. So again, whether a person would like to voluntarily test for having the virus or not. In general, if you suspect that something is wrong, you don't feel well, then the more information and the earlier the better, because then you can seek immediate treatment. But here, there is an issue, because unlike, for example, checking for cancer, if you test positive for COVID-19, there are a couple of things. First, you must immediately self-quarantine, which is painful and costly. Second, by law, you are not allowed to keep the information to yourself, and then the authorities will try to track the people who are in indirect contact with you in the last couple of days and ask them to quarantine, so that it directly affects others who will very likely would not even know this thing occurred, because the likelihood that something will happen to them is very minor. And the last thing, it may be most relevant to a small country like Israel, where I am now, or at least in the beginning, you will always be labeled, if it turns out positive, you will always be labeled as you are patient number 66. And this is not necessarily a desirable adjective to carry on your back. So this aspect decreased the incentive of someone to get tested, and even if it was freely available and you just can go and just test for it. And the question is, how do we incentivize people to do so in this time? Because we need this information. Perhaps reminding someone that once you had it, if you had it, you will have some immunity, so you will be less afraid of going outside. Maybe this is something that help to incentivize people, but maybe there are more issues going on. So that will be my one relation of my work to the pandemic in hand.
Great, thank you very much. And now we'll move to Sendri. So Sendri, you know, you also as a neuroeconomist and someone that thinks about the brain's processing, you know, you think about the role of predictions, motivations and goals, which I think, you know, have already been introduced here, and of course, time constraints and choice behavior, and how these impact the decision processes in the brain. So I thought maybe you would start with a little preamble of how your work can be framed in these conversations as well.
Yeah. So I'm in my lab. We're in Toronto, the Decision Neuroscience Lab. And what we're interested in is developing essentially neurobiologically informed or plausible computational models of choice, which we are then typically applying to a lot of different behavioral phenomena, including things like self-control failures, but also things like health decision-making, altruism, moral decision-making, et cetera. And so one of the things that I thought might be interesting to consider sort of in this question about what's rational is that the computational models that have sort of emerged, not only from our work, but from sort of a decade or two now of work on how the brain makes choices, is that the way people actually make choices often doesn't always completely conform to sort of an economic model of sort of rational choice, where what we're doing is in theory, what we should be doing is calculating the expected value of an action. So what you should do is essentially, when considering any kind of action, like should I, go out for a walk, or should I sort of quarantine myself in my apartment? Should I wear a mask when I go outside? Things like that. What we should do is we should just sort of add up the potential costs and the potential benefits of that action. Maybe do something like decide how important each of those costs and benefits are to ourselves. Maybe also, and especially in a case like this, decide how likely they are, and sort of give more weight to things that are more important or more likely, and give less weight to things that are less likely, right? And so the idea is you sort of figure out all these costs and benefits, you weight them appropriately, you add them up, and then you make your choice. So, okay, so that seems like a good model. And in fact, like Benjamin Franklin, has this long treatise about how this is how he makes important decisions. He sort of lists all these different considerations. But the issue is that it's pretty clear from our computational models that this is really just not generally how people make choices, probably because of a whole bunch of constraints that end up in sort of a boundedly rational process of making a choice. So one thing that we know is that people seem to have difficulty thinking about a ton of different things at once. They're probably best at just sort of considering one thing at a time. Each of those things sort of takes some time to process, so it's not like you immediately know what it would mean to sort of risk your life by not wearing a mask, or immediately know what it would feel like to go outside. You sort of have to take some time to actually think about that. And we also know things, we sort of have this idea that the brain itself isn't really, it's not a perfect computer, so it doesn't always perfectly calculate the value of any of these things. It sort of calculates a rough value that might vary from moment to moment, maybe because of neural firing, maybe because of fluctuations in attention, et cetera, et cetera. And so what it seems like is that to deal with these kinds of constraints or limitations, a solution that the brain maybe and people more generally seem to arrive at is essentially what's known as sequential sampling of outcomes, essentially. So you can sort of think about this as a strategic process where what we might do is, instead of like doing this exhaustive search, and this sort of relates to David's point, instead of doing an exhaustive search over all possible costs and benefits, what you do is you sort of sample one at a time the potential costs and benefits. You sort of think about it, you kind of add it to a running tally of how good or bad what you've been thinking about so far is. And at some point, when you've thought about enough of these different considerations, one at a time, you make a choice. And of course, strategically, what this also means is that you might want to be a little bit deliberative about, or you might want to be systematic about what things you think about first. So classic example here is if you were trying to make a choice about Russian roulette, for instance, where say there's one bullet in a gun chamber. If you were making a decision based off of this sampling process, is just sort of thinking about the outcomes, and you sort of think about them roughly in the probability that they're going to occur. And maybe you only get to think about one or two things before you actually get to make your choice. What that might mean is you would essentially, if you were just thinking about one thing or two things before making your choice, it might not be the case that you would always think about the bullet in the gun chamber. And then, of course, you'd be given that death is the likely outcome of Russian roulette in that case, that's a really bad outcome if you don't think about it in this sort of process of sequential sampling. So we think that what people do is they essentially try to sample maybe first or more often from extreme outcomes. So death obviously is one of the most extreme outcomes. So even if death isn't very likely, we think that when people are doing this process of sampling, they're probably thinking about it much more often than might be justified based on its probability. And I think this is certainly relevant to something like understanding the decision-making in the COVID-19 crisis, because of course we're having to make these choices about how to behave, when to go outside, what risks to take, when should we go back to a restaurant, and we're having to estimate the risks of doing that and weigh those against the probability of enjoying ourselves, basically. And I think it's debatable, but I think one question that I think would be interesting to think about is whether people are essentially being overly cautious because of this sort of extremity weighted sampling. So for instance, even if the likelihood of catching COVID is very small, and especially if you're young, the likelihood of actually suffering, actually dying from it is very low. Because those are extreme outcomes, people might sort of oversample or essentially think about those things more often than they should when they're deciding whether to go out or not. And I think time will tell a little bit whether people are sort of being overly cautious. And the other thing I wanted to talk about, which I think is really interesting and maybe sheds a little bit of light on political decision making, is that another implication of these sequential sampling models is that time pressure really matters, right? So if you know that you're sort of limited in the number of things you can think about, and time pressure and stress and things like that limit the number of things you can think about deeply, then what you should do is be even more strategic about this extremity weighted sampling. So you should be even more likely than normal to think about the most extreme outcomes first and make your decision based only on that consideration. And we see this in a lot of our data, where we see that essentially when we put people under time pressure, they sort of become more extreme. They sort of toss out every other consideration and they focus on one thing and one thing only. And I was thinking that this is really also true not on an individual level, but on a macro scale for things like, say, in the US, the Congress deciding to pass enormous bills, spending bills. And what you see is that early on in that crisis, I think there was this sense that there was very little time that we had to do anything meaningful, right? We had to do something. And so you see the parties all of a sudden throwing out every other consideration, national debt, how to, do this, et cetera, and essentially focusing on one thing and one thing only, which was infusing cash into the economy. But now, as we kind of maybe start to get into this period where we're sort of at a steady state, that means that the time pressure maybe has been released a little bit. And so you might actually start to see, as we are seeing, a lot more bickering, right? People are starting to try to consider, again, and trade off a whole bunch of different things in forming this legislation. And so you might sort of predict that even if we need, say, another, and we can argue about this, right? But even if, in theory, we should have more stimulus spending, it might be much harder to get to that now because essentially the time pressure's off. So those were sort of my thoughts about how people might be sort of rationally and irrationally responding to the crisis.
Thanks, Henry. I also want to thank you for mentioning Ben Franklin, the founder of the University of Pennsylvania, and our patron saint.
There you go.
So we can't let a day go by or an opportunity be missed to mention Franklin. This is also very interesting, but we kind of skirted around we talked about rationality, but we never really defined it exactly. And I think, for people who are not economists, rationality, sort of colloquial notions of rationality mean you're kind of thinking logically, and right? It is sort of the antithesis of what some of our leaders seem to be doing. But in economics, it's sort of a more special definition of rationality, which involves, which actually we talked a lot about departures from economic rationality here. So it's sort of the assumption that you have complete information and you're acting to maximize your own ability or something like that. And of course, with that kind of definition, I think an economist can make anything seem rational. Like for a heroin addict, it's rational to take more heroin because it certainly increases ability relative to going through withdrawal. So that's I think that's all pretty interesting to get at. But Colin, to get back to you, I guess what you're considering is that the habit system is rational in the sense that it's been built in, right, by evolution, because it solves a problem of making behavior much more efficient, right? And that's the sense in which it, and I guess it fits into this idea of bounded or ecological rationality. It's not so much that it's a constraint, it's actually a solution to a problem.
Yeah, exactly. So we do have a kind of menu of words people use in economics and behavioral economics. Bounded rationality is something like, you're building a robot that has to get from one part of a crowded room to the other, but you only have so much, RAM, or you can, so much energy, right? And so, trying to achieve full rationality is kind of a mistake. And instead, it's much more like an engineering problem of how do you get near a perfect solution given the limited resources. Another term that Herb Simon used was procedural rationality. Is there a system which is sort of justifiable? And you also mentioned ecological rationality, or kind of evolutionary adaptation. So I think once you think about, you move away from the standard, I call it the pre-behavioral economics view of rationality, which is ability maximization under constraint. The constraints still come in, but it ends up being much more like the way computer scientists think about playing chess, which is to not solve chess, right, but instead create a sort of simplified representation of the entire chess world, and then try to approximate really good play, and then tinker and learn and move along. And so I think habits are, a way of doing that kind of approximation.
Yeah, and what's fascinating about that is essentially the same principles of reinforcement learning underlie our kind of habit formation, the way we learn about the world, as well as the powerful algorithms that drive machine learning, right? So it's really kind of all the same thing. And that's actually kind of a really beautiful, I think, parallelism there, right? Which is that evolution arrived at the same solution that computer science has largely arrived at. To get at this idea of ecological evolutionary rationality, I think we all appreciate this. It's easy, to forget, but we're trying to operate in this environment with what's essentially a 5 million year old Swiss Army knife in our heads that evolved to confront or to deal with the challenges that confronted our ancestors daily, right? They were living in small groups. They had to find food, right? They had to chase away predators, and time horizons were probably not very long, and there weren't, many sources of information that they probably had to pay attention to. So that's what we have in our heads, and now we have to deploy that, use that in a situation that is utterly, not only profoundly different from what our brains learn to expect in terms of the environment during our lifetimes, but it goes kind of outside the bounds of what our Swiss Army knife in our heads really evolved to deal with.
There's also, I think, given that question about sort of ecological rationality, there's some interesting work, I think, that bears on this crisis, which suggests that ecological rationality has also shaped cultural responses, essentially, right? So human beings evolving in Asia, for instance, are thought to have faced this sort of pathogen threat much more consistently than humans evolving in, say, the plains of Africa or in Europe or something like that. I think, or in the U.S., for instance, we sort of just generally have less threat, and so the idea is that you might even see that down to the level of genetics, such that things like serotonin genes that tend to sort of lead to something like amygdala threat responses, maybe correlated with threat responses. Those are much more common in Asian cultures than they are in European cultures. And that might be in part because they've had to deal with these kinds of disease threats much more frequently. And of course, another thought about potentially even rational responses to that, of course, is this sort of in-group, out-group distinction, where you sort of stick to an in-group, you're protected within that group, and you avoid exposure to threatening to diseases or other things that might be brought in from outside. And of course, now I think, now that essentially now you don't get local disease, right? You get it spread across the whole globe. So I think it'll be really interesting to think about. And you see that too. Asian cultures seem to be much more prepared to deal, in some sense, with these threats because they've had to before.
Yeah, so that, are we kind of genetically and culturally doomed to fail here in the U.S.?
No, I feel like that. So the other part of this that we haven't talked about so much, of course, we have habits that are sort of maybe built in, some hardwired, some learned. But then, of course, we have all of this extra machinery for, getting out of the cases in which habits lead us astray. And so, I think saying that Western society is doomed because we don't have the right genes is the wrong way of thinking about it. It might require extra work on our parts, maybe, for various reasons, but that doesn't mean we're doomed.
So I think, if I may, do you hear me? Yes. So I have a little different perspective on it because, as Zab suggested, maybe. So, of course, when all this pandemic started, I kept thinking like, well, it will be interesting, like what will stay with us in the long run and what will disappear. And I think that the way I see it, and again, it may be, let me give you the Israeli in me perspective. We think about states, okay? There is a state of emergency. State of emergency, let it be war, let it be health pandemic. This is emergency. In that state, we are united and we do what we are asked. You asked me to put mask, I'll put mask. You ask me to stay at home, I'll stay home. I'll do everything needed. Once this is over, it's like a water. You open the dam, we are back to normal. Now we are not in the state, we are not in war, there is no pandemic anymore. Now we are back to life. Now we go to the beach. Now we keep shaking hands. We keep hug. I'm just waiting to go out of the quarantine for 14 days. And then I see my parents and I just hug them because that's it. That's life. So I think that unless it's something that really goes for a long time, the pandemic is a short event and it will be a finite event. And it's unclear, and I believe that it's unclear even when you will see the students come to campus, hopefully, in September and October. I will doubt if suddenly they will take care and say, okay, now sitting 2 meters apart is like that's what we need to do. I'm a bit skeptical, or at least it's still too early to know what will stay with us and what will not. I think.
I think it's a super interesting question. It gets back to some of the things Colin was talking about. Well, I mean, it probably relates a lot to like how built up your own model of the world is and how much time you've had to sample that. So for somebody our age, the normal has been the dominant normal over our lifetime, but for a kid who's 3, 4, 5 years old, it may be a lot different. I see this in my own kids. I mean, my youngest son is 10, and he's like he doesn't want to leave the house anymore, and he's now become perfectly adapted to just staying in his room, and he couldn't be happier. And I can't drag him out of the house. He doesn't want to run around anymore. So there may be a big difference between generations.
Even if he knows that his friends are leaving their house.
He wants to see his friends, but he's perfectly happy to see them online. They have their 5 o'clock Zoom video game session, and that's enough for him. So which it's great that he has something, but it's also a little bit disturbing in terms of like Colin was saying, like how do we now kind of nudge him back into real life as we consider it? So how do we create a tube strike? Like, I don't know, in the house, like, can we block off access to his floor of the house? We live in a brownstone, so everything's very vertical. So that he has to go out. So I don't know. I find that to be a pretty interesting set of questions. One of the things that you also got me thinking about my kid's Sendri, because when you're talking about extremity-weighted sampling, and I had a huge argument with my 17-year-old last night because I have a birthday coming up. And my wife had suggested, maybe we could go to the park with some friends, but we'll socially distance. And my 17-year-old son, absolutely not. You can't do that. And I said, but the risk is essentially zero. And he said, but essentially is more than zero. And so you must not, I will not tolerate it. It's like, it's maddening, right?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I also wonder, I mean, on this question of sort of the difference between young and old, one question I wonder about is, I think there's a little bit of research, I think it's shaky, but, whether as you grow older, one of the things you are able to do better is sort of do this kind of trade-off. And so maybe you're sort of seeing that with your son, where he sort of gets one sample and kind of fixates on it. But the other thing I think is really interesting is sort of, just bringing it to the neuroscience, right? I was thinking this morning because I was walking with Will Cunningham, who some of you may know, who's a professor here at University of Toronto. He has a 2-year-old boy. And we just know that the brains of children are more plastic. And maybe that's good in the sense that they can recover more quickly. But they're also, I think, prepared to learn more quickly too. And so I just wonder how much they're learning that will sort of stick with them. I was watching this 2-year-old sort of get sort of herded by his father to completely avoid physical contact with anything. Anyway.
I have a question I think that maybe Sendri and Colin might be able to address, which is, in the conversation about habit formation and pushing people, to explore an environment, given the complexities of what happens under not necessarily time constraints, but other kinds of pressures, like that uncertainty brings. I mean, it's very clear that what we don't do is like a perfect calculation of probability, right? Like that's a really like unlikely thing that we do. And, and over again, I think people emphasize how under time constraints or under, very high levels of stress and load, that we lean on actually our sort of standard operating procedures or habits, and so, my question to Colin would be like, how do you push people out of that in the context that we're experiencing right now, and how might we integrate what we know from the neural processing for both you and Sendri, to sort of factor that into the decision making process that we're under.
There is some evidence. It's not typically, when I say evidence, it's usually pretty small scale tasks that either humans are doing or building on a very firm foundation of evidence from animals, basic. I mean, we're animals too, right? We just have more neocortex. That stress increases reliance on habits. On the other hand, like David was sort of alluding to, that it's not a spike of stress, right? It's more like this everyday increase in just, there's a lot of sources of negative affect. I don't get to see people in the same way. I don't feel this sort of intimacy of hanging out with my friends or girls' night out or the picnic at Rittenhouse Square. I would love to think about how you might see that in data. So there is a lot of, we've been working with data from Weibo, which is like a Twitter in China. And, you just kind of look at the things people talk about a lot. What are the spikes? And, the hope is that you could sort of have a model of how people switch between habitual behavior and then new things, whether it's forced exploration or what have you, and then see that in data. And, I wish I could give you like a quick punchline of what we've seen so far. It does look like you probably would see this on Twitter too and Facebook if you kind of just crunch the numbers. There are big spikes, like when there was a shutdown in Wuhan, where the whole city was huge city was locked down in China early in the pandemic. There's a big spike in searches in talking on Weibo about hand washing, sanitation, et cetera, and food delivery. There's a big spike in discussions of food delivery. And then when the city was kind of opened up, there was no more new cases. The spike goes down, and it ends up like about 1/3 of the way from the old normal to the new normal. Now, those things like Weibo and Twitter chat are not behavior. People are typing, but the fact that people are typing about food delivery may or may not have a relationship with whether they're actually getting food delivered. But it looks like I think if I had to guess right now, I think most things we're going to do next year or 2022, let's say, will be familiar. The parks will be equally crowded as they were before, but where there's a difference, it'll be about kind of 1/3 above baseline, and it probably will revolve around maybe around hygiene. And for example, we may have fewer flu deaths in the future, as a lot of you know. That the regular flu, well, it's always mutating, kills a lot of people every year in flu season. And it may be those will actually go down because people will have new, just higher use of sanitizers. Or you go into where I live, there's a 7-Eleven, and there's a big bunch of signs saying, we can only take so many customers at a time. Please wear a mask. There's a big plexiglass between you and the cashier, and there's a hand sanitizer. And when people go in and out, they use the hand sanitizer. And I think that probably will be something like a permanent change that may actually have a pretty big public health effect.
Yeah, the other thing that occurs to me in sort of response to Colin is that it's not just necessarily habits, but also affordances, right? So we basically know that people hate effort. And so you make things low effort and they will gravitate towards those things very quickly. You make them high effort and it'll take a lot to push them that way. And so I think what you're doing with something like putting the hand sanitizer right by the door is maybe you're instilling a habit, but you're also just removing any effort required on a person's part to sanitize their hands. And so I think, you'll probably see a mix not only of people developing habits, but those things that will stick are things where we develop solutions that now make something much simpler.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
The economists will be very proud of you. Exactly. Yeah. So like design details and the kind of architecture of hygiene will actually, I mean, that's economic in this sense that we would, which I'm now going to portray, would say that's lowering transaction costs, and it is. But also the way in which that works has to do with motor systems and the term center use affordances, which is what's physically easy for you to do. And so there's a kind of post-pandemic design shift, which will be a big part of the thing too. And some of those things will be very good.
So I want to kind of circle back to, and this gets back to Alan's initial entree into this discussion, that they're actually in the brain. There are two systems. One, that there are many systems, but with relevance to habit versus exploration, there's a system that's very powerful that stamps in habits by learning to do things that make life just a little bit better, right? And this is driven by reinforcement learning, associated with very hard to unstick from those habits because it's so powerful. If you're a smoker, right, and you're addicted to nicotine, you get it. So because that's so powerful, all animals actually have built into their nervous systems in some way a mechanism to get unstuck from habits, so to provoke exploration. In mammals, in human beings, we understand that circuitry pretty well. It's a circuit that shuts off when we're performing routine behavior, and that becomes sort of hyperactive when we explore, and it becomes active in anticipation of divergent behavior, divergent thinking, and it's activated by a number of different things that are really interesting with regard to this discussion, because the kinds of things that get it active are like when the world seems really crappier than it used to, when things don't work anymore, when there's high volatility and high uncertainty in the environment, and when there are people around. So just the fact that there are people around and they're doing different things kind of revs this system up, because it is forcing you to simulate and explore and potentially look for new options. And one of the things that we found, this is all work in animals, is that if you can get access to the circuit and you can directly stimulate it, you can provoke exploration like immediately. So an animal who has a total routine that they always engage in, and you stimulate here, you can make them break off of that habit and do something new. And conversely, if you damage it or inactivate that system, then you can make it much more difficult to get unstuck. So animals have much more difficulty learning that there are better things they can do in the environment, because they just keep doing the same thing over and over again when they don't have this system. So they really are concrete. They solve different kinds of problems, and in each person, the other thing, kind of getting at these genetic and cultural differences, in each person, the balance of those two systems, in a sense, is a little bit different, right? So some people are a little bit more exploratory. They're the innovators. They're the entrepreneurs. They're the people with ADHD. And then on the other side of things are people who are much more into routine, right? And in the extreme, you could think of quite obsessive and performing the same, washing your hands 20 times a day. So there's a real concrete biology to all this.
Yeah, I want to add something. So in 1982, Milton Friedman, of all people, is a famous economist, that it's only in times of crisis that you get real change. And if you think about coordinated change, I'm very interested in telework, right? Partly because my wife has been working at home for a long time. She works in the tech industry. And I think if you did a poll of certain kinds of businesses, again, say knowledge professionals, could be software engineers, and you said, should we all switch to working at home? A lot of people would have said yes, and then it's up to the corporate overlords to kind of decide, how do we do that? How do we make sure people are getting work done? Now all of a sudden we don't have to pay rent for huge expensive office buildings in downtown San Francisco or Palo Alto or New York or Philly, center city. But the tricky part is coordinating that change, right? These are organizational level routines, which are really hard to coordinate. It's a classic problem in kind of applied game theory of, if everyone wants to do something, but you only do it if everyone else does, how do you actually affect And the pandemic is a sort of a potential cure. So I think that for some companies, 3 years from now, mostly people will be working at home. They'll be very happy. A few people will be goofing off. It'll be not too difficult to tell who they are. The company won't have to spend money on rent. Essentially, they've given their employees a benefit, a gift is, and but that wouldn't, that wouldn't have happened without this kind of forced exploration at the organizational level. It's still really mysterious which of these things will really stick and whether they'll actually be good or bad. But the organizational level really does kind of require sometimes a crisis. Often it's something like firms are struggling, about to go bankrupt, and they suddenly reorganize and they deal with these things that people had been begging them to do years earlier, but somehow you just didn't have the corporate will or the focus of somebody on top who could make the changes.
I think that also the
Thanks,
habit.
Todd.
Oh,
Yeah,
go ahead.
go ahead, Judy.
No,
Actually, I was going to call on someone to ask you a question. Maurice has an excellent question. I think that is relevant to your work. If you will get on camera.
Sure. I was just going to ask, how do we differentiate between positive information gathering and the excessive information gathering that leads to bad behavior? Or is all information gathering good and we just have to realign how we deal with the information that comes in?
Wow, so this is a difficult question in the sense that a lot of information is very noisy. I think that what I wanted to emphasize is that information may be valuable and also in a rational way, even if it will not affect change your actions. So again, I take a little your question also talk a little about what I see by rational. So again, so rational may be that I need to information is useful and valuable only to the extent that it make me behave differently. But I think, if we take the definition of rational in economics, it's somebody who have like consistent preferences and he just acts according to them. Now, these consistent preferences may involve some intrinsic value of information, right? So it may well be that, again, I call it irrational to avoid information, but it may be that having this feeling of anxiety or hope or some intrinsic attitude toward information is something which is very legitimate. It's just part of my preferences. So it's not really about which information I need to use in order to make decision and which one I can kind of try to avoid and that it should not affect me. I think they are both kind of live together.
Great. Thank you.
Oh, we didn't hear you. We don't hear you.
Audio, Zeb. Well, I mean, to kind of follow on that, David, it's there's some classic neuroscience work that shows that, yeah, in fact, information can be valuable in the sense that getting information can reliably activate dopamine neurons, for example, which are signaling, they're signaling that the world has got a little better, so I got some information in the world because of that, right? And it's something that drives motivated behavior as well. So I think that there's good neurobiological evidence.
It's a good question also to ask what is the relevant source of information these days. Is Facebook a source of information? Is our Prime Minister a source of information? Is whom should we listen to? What is really a good source of information? Because again, it just very few people know something. In a sense that, it's an evolving situation and people have some speculations, but what is really information these days.
I would stick to late night comedy. They seem to have information. But it is, I mean, I think, and this touches on sort of culture and politics and everything too. I mean, it's very hard to get information that's outside of your bubble and to evaluate the sort of the quality of that information. I think that's a challenge, and we all, as we know, we live in these amplified echo chambers. And as thinking, as our data, as our understanding of this disease and the impacts of various kinds of mitigation responses has been changing, and you have to be able to revise your own kind of opinion and preferences on that. That's been very, very challenging to do, because I think my own perspective is that that there's a lag, right? There's like a major lag on at least a lot of my, a lot of the people that I follow. They're not quite adapting as rapidly to a lot of the changing information. That's just my own opinion on that.
Yeah.
I think
so. We're in our last few minutes, so and I had to reboot Blue Jeans, so sorry about that technical glitch. I just wondered if we might, you might offer some advice on, on the overarching theme from each of your perspectives to all of our attendees, like how can they, best use this information and create more, sort of better or different habits or different behaviors.
I'll say one thing, which is when dramatic things are happening, I think one of the things the brain does is to be wholly focused. It's related to something we call projection bias, which is that whatever state we're in now, whether we're hungry, tired, scared, it's easy to think that kind of lasts much longer than it really will. But this is something David said on our practice call the other day when we were first chatting. In 2023, you'll look back at the stock market and you'll think back about the pandemic, and it'll be kind of amusing. Like, remember when we were all on Zoom? So don't panic. I mean, don't panic in the sense that there are tremendous risks. Some people will be at health risk, but a lot of things will go back to normal. And there may be some very positive fallout. So as we were talking about earlier, for example, I think a lot of the big success stories, not all, but many of the big success stories in managing pandemic were in Asia, like in Taiwan. And a lot of that seems to be there's sort of socio-cultural mindset and political systems that are like ready for this because they went through SARS and MERS and bird flu and kind of knew what to do. And not just the government officials, like the vice president of Taiwan is an epidemiologist. Can you imagine, right? Angela Merkel in Germany is a scientist, so they had this combination politician science, synthesis. But the citizens also trusted them. It's like last time we did this, and now we just have to do it again, and it will last 1 month or 2 months or 3 months, and this is just what you do. So it may be that this kind of pandemic preparedness will have come to the US and to UK and other countries that have not done so well, I think, in terms of containment for the first time. And that will be interesting. And it'd be fascinating also, like Michael and others mentioned about their children, like, if a 3 to 8 or 10-year-old living through this, what are their lives going to be like? Like, will they be really mentally prepared? Are there going to be some, I think in some cases, especially lower SES, where it's much more stressful, more people live together, there may be multi-generations, they may not have good Wi-Fi at home, so school has actually been incredibly difficult. Whether they're kind of scarred by this or sort of learn and or become more resilient is an interesting question. I hope they're more resilient, but I think there will be, it's really impacting some groups, hitting some groups very hard, which we don't always see in the news. That is like BBC Dad, where your dog just came in.
Yes, exactly. That's what he does.
David or Sandra, you have any advice?
I already gave you mine. Don't touch your portfolio. just wait. You don't know, nobody know anything. No, but I think also more in general, like I think there is always some residual uncertainty, and I don't know. At least as a scientist, I always think, well, here is a problem. I will think enough. I will get enough information. I will make the right decision. I realize that, especially in the way of pandemic, when people are changing, it's just dynamic, and everything is changed. It will be probably too costly to get or impossible to get to the fact, this is the right decision in some objective way. You just need to give up this, and if you can postpone a tough decision, postpone them. And if you can't, just don't regret doing them, because remember, you take decision ex ante and not ex post. And in hindsight, there is a hindsight bias, I think, to think, you see, how he did it. Well, it may be that in a week or two, it seems like what they did was obvious or so stupid, but that's, because things are changing on us like this. And so that's all I can say, I think.
Yeah, and I guess if there's anything that I think the pandemic has really reinforced for me is just how bad we are as psychologists, neuroscientists, maybe not the economists, I won't, but certainly as psychologists, how bad we are at making good recommendations and predictions. It's just not what our field has really been trained to do, which I think is highlighting something that we as researchers should focus on. So I'm a little bit hesitant to say too much, but I guess I would say, kind of tying it back to my earlier comments about sort of these decisions by samples, and I would say, if there are these biases, the one thing that is clear is that probably taking more samples, especially if you try to make those samples different from the earlier ones, might reduce the biases. And so I think, just remembering that oftentimes we have more time to take a decision than we think, remembering to sort of think about counterfactuals as sort of the most different kind of sample, and then sort of weigh those, I guess that would be my advice, but I'm not sure that's anything more than intuition.
There's nothing wrong with intuition, and so it sounds like if we can just be calm, take your time,
carry on, yes.
Cut yourself some slack, right?
That's right.
Maybe.
And remember that this is not the normal. This is not the normal state.
That's right, and I think just in terms of regret minimization, right? It's like, look, if you make the right decision, more power to you. If you end up evaluating what you did in 6 months as the wrong choice, I mean, come on, this is a really weird time. Our brains don't have much in the way of templates to make choices here that are well informed. So, yeah.
Great. Well, thank you once again for an extraordinary conversation. It's been so enjoyable to spend the last hour with all of you. And please do join us next week. Our conversation will be on not on rational decision making, but on cooperation and social good. How can we become more collaborative and work together for the betterment of society and our communities? All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.